The crowd at the Austin showcase was still laughing when the homeless man knelt down in the gravel, unzipped a faded green canvas bag, and laid out a row of hand tools so worn and so well kept that a carpenter in the front row went completely silent. Chisels wrapped in oiled leather, a wooden block plane older than the CEO mocking him, a folding rule polished smooth by decades of use. Preston Cole had just told this man, in front of 300 people and a dozen cameras, that if he could repair the wrecked $300 tiny house sitting behind the stage, he could keep it. Preston thought he was making a joke. He had no idea he had just handed his entire company to the one man on earth who knew what was hidden inside that house. To understand how badly Preston Cole misjudged that moment, you have to see the scene the way the crowd saw it. It was a bright Saturday morning in the parking lot of the Cole Modular headquarters outside Austin, Texas. Rows of gleaming display homes sat under white tents, tiny houses with cedar siding and solar panels and price tags starting at $90,000. Preston, 42 years old, in a fitted navy blazer and white sneakers, was walking investors through the lineup with a microphone clipped to his collar. Cole Modular had just closed a funding round worth $200 million. The press release called Preston a visionary solving the housing crisis. The irony of what happened next would eventually be quoted in every article written about him. At the back edge of the lot, half hidden behind a dumpster enclosure, sat the company's Shame, an early prototype unit, one of the first tiny houses the company ever displayed, now wrecked beyond recognition. A delivery truck had backed into it 2 years earlier. The roof sagged on one side, the front wall was cracked open, water damage had blackened the floor, and the porch hung off its frame like a broken jaw. Preston kept meaning to have it hauled to the landfill. The quote to scrap it was $300, and somewhere along the way, the staff had just started calling it the $300 house. Walter Hayes had been standing at the fence line of the parking lot since sunrise. 61 years old, gray beard, a weathered Carhartt jacket gone soft at the elbows, watching the event the way a retired pilot watches planes. A security guard had already asked him to move along twice. He didn't beg. He didn't ask anyone for anything. He just watched the houses. And when the tour group swung close to the fence, Walter said, in a quiet voice that carried further than he intended, that the ridgeline on the display model was framed wrong and would leak within 5 winters. Preston heard it. And Preston, with a microphone on his collar, an audience of investors around him, and cameras rolling, decided to have some fun. He walked over to the fence with a grin, waved the crowd in, and asked the old man to repeat himself. Walter did. Calmly, specifically, pointing at the ridge with a cracked finger, describing exactly how the load path would fail. A few people chuckled at the sight of it, a homeless man critiquing a $90,000 home. Preston laughed loudest of all. And then he made the offer that would define the rest of his life. He pointed across the lot at the wrecked prototype rotting behind the dumpsters and said, "If you know so much about houses, repair that one. Repair the $300 house, and it's yours. You can live in it. My gift to you." The crowd roared with laughter. Phones came out. Someone shouted that they should get it in writing, and Preston, playing to the cameras, actually did it. He grabbed a legal pad from an assistant, scrawled out the terms on the hood of a company pickup truck, and signed it with a flourish. One wrecked prototype unit transferred in full to the bearer upon completed repair. 7 days, materials from the scrap pile only, and Preston added one last line while winking at the crowd. Repairs subject to passing a professional structural inspection. Because there was no way, no possible way, a man sleeping under an overpass was going to rebuild a collapsed house with garbage lumber in a week. Walter read the paper twice. Then he folded it into his jacket pocket, walked to the fence gate, and asked security to let him through. And that's when he knelt in the gravel and opened the canvas bag. The tools changed the temperature of the whole parking lot, because people who know, know. A young framer who'd come to the event with his girlfriend leaned over the rope line and stared at the wooden plane like he'd seen a ghost. Those weren't scavenged tools. That was a craftsman's kit, curated over a lifetime, maintained daily, the kind of collection that gets handed down or buried with its owner. Walter sharpened a chisel on a small oiled stone, tested the edge against his thumbnail, and walked toward the wrecked house without saying a word to anyone. The first day, the laughter died slowly, and then, all at once. Walter didn't rush. He circled the broken structure for almost an hour before touching it, running his hands along the cracked studs, tapping the blackened floor and listening, pressing his shoulder against the sagging roofline to feel how the weight wanted to move. Then he began stripping it, carefully, methodically, stacking salvageable lumber in one pile and rot in another, pulling nails and dropping them into a coffee can with a rhythm like a metronome. By afternoon, he had the broken porch off, and the front wall opened up, and a small crowd had drifted back from the shiny display homes to watch the old man work. By day 2, that crowd had lawn chairs. Because watching Walter Hayes work was like watching a documentary about a lost art. He snapped chalk lines by hand. He cut compound angles with a handsaw and hit them dead on, first try every time. When a joint needed to lock 2 salvaged beams together, he didn't reach for brackets from the scrap pile. He carved a dovetail. An honest-to-God, hand-cut dovetail joint, tight enough that when he tapped it home with a mallet, the crowd actually applauded. A woman live streaming from the rope line zoomed in on the joint and said, "To 40 viewers, I don't think this man is who they think he is." By that night, her video had 2 million views. So who was the man behind that green canvas tool bag? Walter Hayes had spent over 30 years as a restoration carpenter, and not an ordinary one. Through the 90s and 2000s, he ran a small shop outside Fort Worth that specialized in the hardest work in the trade, rebuilding historic Texas farmhouses, courthouse staircases, timber frame barns that insurance companies had written off as total losses. Contractors called him when the job was impossible. He never advertised. He never had to. And in 2009, Walter did something ahead of its time. He designed a small, efficient timber cottage under 400 square feet, framed with joinery instead of nail plates, cheap to heat, built to last a century. He called it the Wren House, after his wife Ellen, who loved birds. He drew the plans by hand at his kitchen table and partnered with a small startup that promised to bring affordable versions to working families. Then, Ellen got sick. Ovarian cancer, stage 3, and the next 4 years of Walter's life disappeared into hospital corridors in Dallas. He sold the shop to pay for treatments insurance wouldn't cover. He sold the tools, all but one green canvas bag he could not make himself part with. He missed meetings, missed deadlines, missed everything, because he was holding his wife's hand. And while he was in those hospital rooms, the startup he'd partnered with quietly restructured, buried his name in the paperwork, and sold itself, along with all its design assets, to a bigger fish. Walter got a letter from a law firm and a check that didn't cover 2 months of chemotherapy. Ellen died on a rainy Tuesday in March. The house went next, then the truck. A man can fall a long, long way in this country once the ground gives out and nobody reaches for him on the way down. For 6 years, Walter Hayes was invisible. He slept at a shelter on East 7th when there was room and under the highway when there wasn't, and on Saturday mornings he would walk to wherever houses were being built or shown, and he would stand at the fence, and he would watch. It was the only thing that still felt like his. If this story is hitting you the way it hit me, take 1 second and subscribe, because I tell stories like this every single week. Stories about the people this world overlooks. Now, back to that parking lot in Austin, because this is where everything catches fire. By day 4, the wrecked house had a spine again. The roofline stood straight and proud, reframed with salvaged beams Walter had scarfed together with joints most modern builders have only seen in textbooks. The live streams multiplied. Local news vans showed up. Someone started a pinned map to the site, and strangers began arriving with things Walter never asked for. Tacos and thermoses of coffee. A tarp when it rained. A retired electrician who quietly asked if he could run the wiring under Walter's direction, and a roofing crew that showed up on their day off. Walter thanked every one of them, put them to work, and kept cutting. The internet had found its hero, and the comment sections had found their villain, because the original video of Preston Cole laughing into his microphone was now everywhere, stitched, duetted, replayed in slow motion with sad piano music underneath. Inside the Cole Modular offices, panic set in. Investors were calling. The PR team drafted 3 different apologies and shredded all of them. And on day 5, Preston did exactly what a cornered man with lawyers does. He sent them to the parking lot. 2 attorneys in gray suits informed Walter that the offer had been a joke, a clear jest with no contractual intent, that he was trespassing on private property, and that he needed to vacate the site immediately. Walter listened politely. Then he took the folded legal pad page from his jacket, the one signed on the hood of a pickup in front of 300 witnesses and a dozen cameras, and held it up without a word. Behind him, 70 people raised their phones in unison. One of the volunteers, it turned out, was a contract law professor from the University of Texas, and she stepped forward smiling and explained, loudly enough for every microphone present, the legal concept of a unilateral offer accepted through performance. The lawyers left. The clip of them walking back to their cars got 11 million views in a day. But the real earthquake was still buried inside that house. It happened on day 6 in the evening, when the crowd had thinned and the light had gone golden. Walter was working alone inside the shell of the house, fitting the ceiling when he stopped moving. Onlookers by the rope said he stood frozen for almost a full minute, staring up at the ridge beam, at the original framing at the heart of the structure, the one part of the old prototype that had survived the crash intact. Then the old man climbed down, walked out into the fading light, and sat on the tailgate of a volunteer's truck with his head in his hands. Because Walter had recognized the joinery, not the style, the hand. The way you'd recognize your own signature. The ridge connection was a specific, unusual modified joint that Walter had developed himself, decades ago, for the Wren House. His design, his wife's name. The plans that had vanished into a corporate acquisition while Ellen lay dying in a Dallas hospital bed. The wrecked prototype behind the dumpsters, the throwaway, the $300 joke, was one of the first houses ever built from Walter's stolen blueprints. Cole Modular's flagship design, the one selling for $90,000 a unit under the tents 50 yards away, was the Wren House with new siding and a new name. Preston Cole had built a $200 million company on this man's kitchen table drawings. And then he'd laughed at him through a fence. There was one way to prove it. Walter had a habit, an old restoration carpenter's tradition. Every original piece he ever built, he signed, in pencil, in a place only the next craftsman would ever find, inside the joint itself, where the wood faces meet. If this house was built from his plans by the startup's original crew, using his prototype ridge assembly, his mark might still be in there. On the morning of day 7, with news cameras from 3 networks at the rope line, and Preston Cole himself, standing stone-faced at the edge of the crowd, Walter climbed the ladder one last time. He asked the crowd for silence. Then on camera he explained who he was, what the Wren House was, and what he believed was hidden inside the beam above his head. You could have heard a chalk line drop in that parking lot. Walter loosened the joint he had spent his whole life perfecting, opened the faces of the wood, and shined a flashlight inside. There it was, faded graphite, protected for 15 years inside the joint. W. Hayes, Wren House number 3. For Ellen. The sound the crowd made wasn't a cheer. It was something deeper, a gasp and a roar at once. A reporter said it live on air, "This changes everything," and it did. Preston Cole didn't wait for questions. He walked to his car through a wall of cameras, and the footage of that walk played on national morning shows for a week. What followed moved fast. 3 separate law firms offered to represent Walter for free by sundown. Discovery unearthed the original acquisition documents, the buried authorship records, emails from the old startup, acknowledging Hayes's designs by name. Cole Modular's board forced a settlement within 4 months, the terms confidential, but reporters noted that Walter's foundation launched shortly after, with an endowment described as substantial, and that Preston Cole stepped down as CEO before the year ended. His last public statement said he was taking time to reflect. The internet did not let him forget. To this day, if you search his name, the first video that appears is a man in a navy blazer laughing at a fence. And the house? Walter finished it, of course. On the evening of day 7, right on deadline, a licensed structural inspector walked the rebuilt home for 40 minutes while the crowd held its breath, then came out, shook his head slowly, and told the cameras it was the finest small structure he had inspected in 30 years of work. He said he'd found joinery in there he'd only ever seen in books. The crowd carried Walter's tool bag to the porch like a trophy. But Walter never moved in. He had it lifted onto a trailer and driven to a lot on the east side of Austin, where it stands today with a small carved sign over the door that reads, Ellen's Wren. It's the office of the Hayes Workshop, a training program where Walter, now in his mid-60s, teaches carpentry to people coming out of homelessness. Men and women who slept where he slept, learning dovetails from the hands that cut them on camera. The workshop has graduated dozens of students into union jobs. Every one of them gets a hand plane on graduation day. Walter buys them himself, secondhand, and restores each one at his bench before handing it over. Someone once asked Walter, in an interview, if he ever thinks about the day Preston Cole laughed at him. He was quiet for a moment, planing a long curl of cedar off a board, and then he said something I haven't been able to stop thinking about. He said the laughing never bothered him much. What bothered him were the 6 years before it, when nobody looked at him at all. Cruelty at least sees you, he said. It's the invisibility that kills people. So here's what I'd ask you to sit with. Walter Hayes was the same man at that fence line that he was in that courtroom. Same hands, same knowledge, same lifetime of mastery. The only thing that changed was that someone finally handed him a chance, and he happened to be holding his tools. How many Walters did you walk past this week? You don't know what's folded up inside the people this world has decided to stop seeing. Nobody does. That's the whole point. If this story moved you, subscribe, because next week I'm telling the story of a waitress who spent 2 years quietly paying for one old man's breakfast. Right up until the morning, a row of black SUVs pulled into the diner parking lot asking for her by name. You do not want to miss that one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.